Steve, I want to start with the most fundamental question. This podcast is called Mind Body Solution, and it's obviously paying homage to the mind body problem. But I find that definitions play a huge role with this podcast, and many people want to know your definition or the guest's definition of something. So in this case, let's talk about how do you define or differentiate between consciousness, the self, and the mind?
So before I jump into such a complex issue, I think I should give you a little background about how I got started as a scientist who eventually thought he had anything to say about consciousness, mind, and self. And I think it's a good story because the moral of the story is you're never too young to follow your life's passion. So my life's work began in 1957, before you were born. But I was 17 years old, and I was a college freshman taking introductory psychology at Dartmouth College. And it was in that year that I introduced the field of neural networks. And that was because I was inspired by basic facts about how humans learn. And the psychological data led me to derive my first neural models of how brains make minds. And you might say, well, how does that happen? And I was led from mind to brain because brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success. So without brain mechanisms, one can't understand psychological functions, including learning. But without the psychological functions, the brain mechanisms have no behavioral meaning. So to me, I always felt the need, since I was always thinking in real time about how does this kind of learning or other human experience emerge moment by moment in real time, I had to think about what's going on in there to enable it. And over the years, it's become clear that interactions and within and across several brain regions are often needed to generate these psychological behaviors. And the behaviors are really emergent properties of these interactions. It's not like a computer code. But purely experimental approaches cannot fully understand emergent properties, even if you have 100 electrodes in a awake-behaving monkey. The emergent property and behavior, there's an explanatory gap. And for that, you need models. So I was driven as a freshman to derive my first neural models. I introduced the paradigm of using systems of nonlinear differential equations. I introduced cell activations or short-term memory traces. I introduced long-term memory traces or adaptive weights for learning and memory. And I also introduced what I like to call medium-term memory, which is activity-dependent habituation. In a word, if you fire them too long, cells can get tired. But to derive the models, I had to develop a modeling method and a cycle because you can't derive a whole brain all at once. And God knows that I hardly knew anything when I got started. So because brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success, such a method would always start by analyzing scores or even hundreds of psychological experiments, since these are the experiments that define the behavior we want to understand. And the method showed how to discover design principles that underlie these large psychological databases. And you might say, well, how does that happen? And here I just have to quote the greatest of them all, Albert Einstein. It was a speculative leap. If you live in hundreds of experiments long enough, you can begin to see what the underlying principles and mechanisms are that generated those behaviors as emergent properties. It's a gift, it's a leap. There is no algorithm for it, and the way to learn it if you're lucky, is to study with someone who does it well. And that's what I did with all my students. And then after you get the design principles, you've got to derive the minimal models that embody them. And then show how models can be used to explain lots more psychological data than the hypotheses that you use to derive them. Otherwise, you'd just be going in circles. And you might say, well, why minimal models? It's the principle of parsimony. It's Occam's razor. Even if I might know, oh, there's this interneuron and I haven't yet put in this or that or the other, by being honest about it and only deriving the model that I knew at that time from the postulates, that put huge pressure on me to derive the next more integrated model. And the big surprise to me when I was a boy of 17 is that these models looked like, they helped me model data, and the models themselves looked like biological neural networks. Mm. And the bottom line is learn how to think in real time. That's an art. So, as I indicated, no one derivation can derive a whole brain. Mm-hmm. But after doing the derivation and explaining what I could with that stage of modeling, I could sort of begin to see the boundary, I like to call it, between what I knew and what I didn't know. And by understanding a little bit about the shape of that boundary, I could figure out what new design principle or hypothesis I left out. I put that in and then derive the next more complex model in a self-consistent way without undermining what I had already done, which would have been, frustrating. And so the new model always included the old model, although somehow in a more sophisticated form. I'll mention briefly, eventually, I was led to models that linked the lamina or layered circuits of cerebral cortex to different kinds of behavior like vision, recognition, speech, language, movement. And I never dreamed when I was a boy that could ever happen. But it also was what led to understand how we learn to pay attention, to recognize and predict objects and events in a changing world. And I say changing world because I was always thinking about dynamics. We're always evolving, we're always growing. And with this foundation, I was eventually forced into a functional understanding of consciousness. And I have to admit immediately, I never try to understand consciousness.
Yes.
You don't wake up in the morning and say, oh, hey, today I'm going to understand consciousness, Never could happen. Just as I never thought when I started studying psychology and learning that I would be thrown into the neurodynamics behind learning. These are the things that happen if you're honest and lucky enough to find true principles, because they will never disappoint you. I call it the gift that keeps on giving. And so most of my work emerged from an analysis of self-organization, both in development and learning, notably how we can learn quickly without suffering from catastrophic forgetting, otherwise expressed, how we can learn quickly without forgetting just as quickly, which of course was a topic very much on the mind of a young student. Mm. And learning quickly without catastrophic forgetting, I've come to call solving the stability-plasticity dilemma, where the plasticity is the learning and the stability is the fact that memories are buffered so you don't have catastrophic forgetting. And that's how I was led to introduce adaptive resonance theory, or ART, or I just say ART, in 1976 to solve the problem. And given that I was starting in ART to understand learning, I think it's still remarkable that art dynamics also showed me something of the underlying mechanisms of conscious states of seeing, hearing, feeling, and knowing. And emphatically, art also explains that you're not there to just contemplate platonically the beauty of the world. You're using these conscious states to plan and act, to realize valued goals. They're essential to our survival. So, and this introduction can lead me to try to answer your next three questions, because they're all intimately linked. And after I do that, ask me again, and I'll comment about mind and self, because I'm not quite ready.
I think while we're on, before we go to these questions, I just want to say that many scientists and philosophers that I've spoken to on this podcast have spoken about you with so much respect. They put your name up there with some of the greatest scientists of all time. They call you the Newton of the brain, the Einstein of the mind. And I've noticed this is a pattern. This is not something that's just one or two people say. I mean, some people call you the greatest living scientist of all time. And having been reading your work for very much most of my life, I can honestly say that I very much agree with him, with that sentiment. I mean, your work is very, very in-depth, intriguing, but not only that, you manage to bridge so many gaps of different fields, this multidisciplinary approach that I think is very vital when it comes to understanding anything. You've managed to bridge so many different fields together. Just congratulations.
Thank you. It's very kind of you to say that, and especially when you're talking to an old man. I've been working like a dog for 66 years, so I like hearing things like that. But also a key point, and I can't overemphasize it, you have to get really intimately familiar with the large enough databases so that they can help you find the simple design principles that can lead to, real insight, things you never dreamed you'd understand. Of course, once you get that intuitive grasping of some of the principles, then you have to face the tough honesty of mathematics. And then you have to become technical. So I think my main gift is being able to see to the heart of data, what it means. And then I have enough technique to carry out the program. And that's one reason, if not the main reason, that I got a PhD in mathematics. And one of my professorships is Professor of Mathematics and Statistics. So I had the tools to carry out my intuitive ideas in a quantitative and testable way. So,
well, Steve, on that note, let's continue with this theme. You talking about mathematical principles. Let's elaborate on the mathematical models that underpin art, adaptive resonance theory for everyone listening. And then let's also discuss a brief overview of the theory and the key principles that underline this theory and how it provides this rigorous solution to the mind-body problem.
Okay, I'm happy to try. So, as I already noted, I was always fascinated by how humans learn so quickly without being forced to forget just as quickly. And this is the stability-plasticity dilemma that I introduced adaptive resonance theory to solve. But even with adaptive resonance theory, you don't do that waking up one day and say, oh, today I'm going to solve the stability-plasticity dilemma, because you don't even know that there exists such a dilemma. So before I introduced art, I introduced what many people like to competitive learning now. And I did that in 1976. And that explains how humans and various other mammals, at very least, learn recognition categories, where recognition category is a cell population that fires selectively to spatial patterns of activation across a network of feature selective neurons. So, for example, such a spatial pattern of feature selective neurons might represent spatially organized features of a face or of a painting. And if you learn recognition categories for the face and the painting, then you'll have cells that can recognize your face and recognize a painting you love by Matisse. So a competitive learning category can learn to selectively fire in response to a particular face or painting, or indeed any spatial pattern of features that's presented to the network. And so first, let me explain how a spatial pattern of activation across feature selective cells is computed, so there isn't an explanatory gap here. So individual neurons or nerve cells can respond selectively to certain combinations of features. And when they respond, their activity often increases. They're firing. And such an activity, I like also to call a short-term memory trace or STM trace. It's realized by a change in membrane potential. The main reason it's a short-term memory trace is, can I get this in that? Mm-hmm. It's hard to do in the picture because of the angle. The cell gets active for a little while, and then it loses its activity if nothing else is happening. Mm. So the pathways from these active features to the categories are adaptive. They can learn. The end of each pathway has a process that's often called an adaptive wait or a long-term memory trace as opposed to the short-term memory trace or activation. And the long-term memory trace learns in response to correlations between the active feature selective cell that's sending the signal down the pathway and the category selective cell that's active when the signal is received. So it's correlation learning. And the category cell learns to respond not just to one pathway, it learns to respond to a spatial pattern of activity across all the feature selective cells that send it pathways. We're taken together, all the pathways taken together are called an adaptive filter or a bottom-up adaptive filter because they're enabling the category to respond selectively, let's say, to a face or a painting, okay, which has to have a spatially distributed input. So competitive learning was good as far as it went, and it responds well to sparse input environments. Well, what does that mean? In fact, even deep learning doesn't experience catastrophic forgetting in a sparse input environment. What it means that the input patterns aren't too close together in pattern space, if you think of them as points in a multidimensional space. And so I published a stable sparse learning theorem about competitive learning in 1976, showing if the input vector space is sparse, everything is good. You learn nice categories that are stable. But I then realized that if there are too many input patterns for the way you've constructed the network, or the inputs that are presented through time are related to each other, like you might have a statistical drift in changing inputs through time, then previously learned categories got washed away by new learning. Mm. So competitive learning experiences catastrophic forgetting. Now, that isn't good because we know we live in a blooming, buzzing confusion where we're bombarded with inputs and nothing is sparse. Everything is overlapping. But in 1975, as luck would have it, I was studying reinforcement learning and I realized the importance of a learn top-down expectation. So just like a bottom-up adaptive pathway, A top-down expectation has an adaptive weight or a long-term memory trace. So you have a category and it's going to send a signal to a feature selective cell top-down, and there's an adaptive weight abutting that feature selective cell. And if you look at all of the pathways from that category to all the feature selective cells and all their long-term memory traces, I say it learned a top-down expectation because it learned patterns of activity across the feature selective cells when the category was active. And so if you read out that category, it would expect to see that pattern. So taken together, all the long-term memory traces and the top-down pathways from a category cell to the feature selective cells is therefore called a learned expectation. So I then realized from my reinforcement learning work, here we're facing catastrophic forgetting and competitive learning. I then realized that adding these learned top-down expectations to a category learning network solves the stability-plasticity dilemma, i.e., it prevents catastrophic forgetting. And so how does adaptive resonance get into the story? Because when both the bottom-up adaptive filter and the top-down expectation are simultaneously active, you have a positive feedback loop and a resonance can develop. So in art, resonances occurs when there are excitatory feedback signals between the bottom-up and the top-down pathways between two or more brain regions, and when these patterns match their signals well enough to cause the active cells to synchronize. A lot of brain rhythms synchronize. And because it's a positive feedback loop, they sustain this synchronized activity at an enhanced activity level, and that's enough to trigger learning, but in a very selective fashion. And that's why I called the theory adaptive resonance theory. And you solve the catastrophic forgetting problem because, as I'll say a little more clearly in a moment, you suppress outlier or irrelevant features. You only learn relevant stuff and you dynamically stabilize that learning. So, but let me just make a summary statement before I move to the next related theme, that art explains how multiple processing stages in our brains use excitatory bottom-up adaptive filters and top-down learned expectations to attend, because the expectations help us to pay attention to what we expect to see based on past experience, to attend, recognize, and also predict objects and events in a changing world without experiencing catastrophic forgetting. So, in this way, art showed that there's an intimate link in our brains between processes of learning, expectation, attention, resonance, and synchrony. But I gradually realized that art was explaining a ton of data about the parametric properties of real-time behaviors that were conscious behaviors. So through the back door, as it were, I was led to begin to understand consciousness, because these adaptive resonances were supporting a particular kind of conscious awareness that I will clarify more in a moment. So in other words, art proposed an intimate link in our brains between processes of consciousness, learning, expectation, attention, resonance, and synchrony. And those letters, C-L-E-A-R-S, spell out the word clears. So I like saying that art mechanistically explains links that occurs between the clears processes in our brains. And it's the learned top-down expectations, as I commented before, that protect us against catastrophic forgetting and solve the stability-plasticity dilemma. But for that to happen, you can't just say, oh, let's throw in any top-down expectation. For example, if you use the kind of inhibitory matching that you have in Bayesian models, you couldn't solve the problem, and moreover, you couldn't learn a damn thing. So the kind of matching in art that ensures this property obeys what I've come to call the art matching rule, because top-down expectations are matching against bottom-up patterns. And I was led with Gail Carpenter to realize that it's realized by a top-down modulatory on-center driving off-surround network. Well, what do those words mean? First, let me just remark that the existence of the prediction that an art matching rule that is realized by this kind of top-down modulatory on-center off-surround network has been supported by psychological, anatomical, physiological data in multiple species, including bats. Nobuo Osuga came to our department once, and he was very excited about his new results about top-down matching in bats, and the circuit obeyed the art matching rule. It had been conserved, at least from bats to humans and monkeys. So matching occurs when a top-down expectation activates the modulatory on-center off-surround net and does so against the bottom-up input pattern. And the question is, do they agree well enough for resonance to occur, or is the mismatch so great that there'll be suppression and reset? And we'll come to that in a moment. But the modulatory on-center by itself, let's say I want to think about, will I see TEP today? So I might want to turn on my TEP face category and I'll read out a prime. Now, if whenever I read out a prime I saw TEP, I'd be hallucinating. But I can have visual imagery of TEP by volitionally through the basal ganglia, upping the gain, and then you'll go from a subthreshold prime to a superthreshold resonance. And I can think about what a nice looking young man this is, okay?
Thanks.
So the modulatory on-center can sensitize, modulate, or prime the cells to which it projects, but it can't fire them to superthreshold levels without support from a matched, sufficiently well-matched bottom-up input pattern, unless you use volitional gain control.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if the expectation is of a friend's face, and if I then saw his face or her face, I'd recognize them at lower thresholds and faster. So in dim lighting, you might say, who is that? And if it's unfamiliar, you might not know. But if it's a familiar person, you have enough matching with the prime to bring it out of the background. So the art matching rule enables top-down expectations to select, attend, and learn the critical feature patterns that control successful predictions, because the modulatory on-center eventually is learning from a learned category to read out the pattern of critical features that are predictive. Mm-hmm. And it's those features that are going to go into the adaptive weights and the bottom-up filters and the top-down expectations. So there's a link between attention and prediction here through this selective learning process. So to summarize, the critical features are learned by the bottom-up adaptive filters, the top-down expectations that carry the excitatory signals that support the resonating cells. at this point, I'm blabbing away. Oh, this guy introduced art. Sure, he loves it. It's his baby. Well, why should you believe it? So, of course, there are at least three kinds of predictive success, of which two of them you'd expect from any theory. The first is all the foundational hypotheses from which I derived art have been supported by subsequent psychological and neurobiological data. So it's compatible with all the data that you need to build a model. And it's also explained and simulated data from hundreds of other experiments. So it has an unrivaled explanatory range. But there's a deeper reason why I think art will survive in some form, because there are variants of art: art 1, art 2, art 2A, art 3, fuzzy art map, distributed art map. Getting to a fully embodied theory of art, of which these are computationally effective examples. So in art, in a famous paper in Psychological Review that I published in 1980, I derived art from a thought experiment. And this is a thought experiment about how any system can autonomously learn to correct predictive errors in a changing world that's filled with unexpected events. So it's not saying mind, brain, blah, blah. And the hypotheses of the thought experiment, familiar facts that we all know from our daily lives. And the import of the thought experiment is that if these facts from daily life act together over the millennia, they're evolutionary pressures for the evolution of our brains, including how we learn to pay attention and recognize things. But these familiar facts, these facts about the environment, they don't say anything about mind or brain. So I'm forced to conclude, I see no way out of the thought experiment, that art's a universal solution of the problem how any system can autonomously learn to recognize and predict the changing world that's filled with unexpected events. And from that perspective, I think it's all the more remarkable that art dynamics also support conscious states of seeing, hearing, feeling, and knowing things, and explains how we can use these conscious states to effectively plan and act to realize valued goals. And I'll explain why that is in a moment. I think you have to ask me another question first. So the proposed solution of the mind-body problem, in summary, arises from a computational analysis of how humans and other animals autonomously learn in a changing world. And that's how consciousness got in the mix, which makes me take for granted that every animal or other organism that can autonomously solve the stability-plasticity dilemma has a form of consciousness. We're not that special, we're real special, but and mind and self, to come back to that, are possible because art solves the stability-plasticity dilemma. Because as a result of that, you can have a lifetime of learning that all gets embedded in increasingly complex interacting awarenesses and abilities and thoughts about how the world works. And collectively, all of them together are our mind. And as you go through life and you accumulate all of this understanding and attach it to your own person, you have an evolving self. So the self I have today is very different from the self I had as a boy, or even when I was in my 30s or 40s. I'm quite a different being in some ways. So maybe I should stop there.
No. I love the fact that you're going on, because this podcast isn't about you. So perfect. The longer the answers, I don't really mind. I'm enjoying it. One thing that has remained certain and similar throughout your years, even though yourself has continuously evolved and changed, is just your drive and tenacity to continue to publish, work. I mean, just to put certain things into context, you were 17 when you had this famous epiphany. And when this happened, you didn't just think of something, you completely shifted the way people think about the mathematical concepts. You did exactly what people like Einstein have done. You thought of a new way of thinking about concepts. So you developed a form of mathematical systems to.
Well, that's why people call me the Newton of the mind, because just like Newton as a boy, I introduced the basic concepts and equations that are used to understand the universe of mind. I'm called the Einstein of the mind because I use thought experiments, just like Einstein derived both special relativity and general relativity from thought experiments. I derived art from a thought experiment. And I also derived my cognitive emotional model from a thought experiment, and competitive networks from a thought experiment. But you don't just wake up in the morning to say, hey, what's my latest thought experiment? It's only after you already have a deep understanding of the targeted class of phenomena that you can step back and see, well, what are the simple ideas that if I carry them out as a logical story, they're conjoint implications, you get to something you never thought you'd understand in the first place. That's the power of it. Someone says, oh, I don't really believe any of this nonsense. And then you say, okay, read the thought experiment, show me where he made a mistake. Because if you can't, and if you believe the simple hypotheses, which we all know, they're not erudite, they're facts of life, then you have to either accept the conclusion or throw away your belief in the scientific method.
Yes. I mean, your work's been transformed into different courses. People are doing lots of different variations of it. It has continued to evolve even beyond you. It's almost as if you're.
I hope so.
No, it has. I've seen versions of it out there, so it definitely has.
Well, just with art, there are multiple varieties. When people are applying art and technology, they want the most efficient algorithm to solve a certain class of problems. And typically, just as in our brain, before you get to infratemporal cortex and prefrontal cortex and other cognitive areas, there's a huge amount of pre-processing, visual pre-processing, retina, lateral geniculate nucleus, V1, V2, V3, AV4. It's all visual pre-processing to prepare the data to be classified and to be a basis for prediction. Before that, things are just too noisy. A lot of people are developing varieties of art to deal with different engineering and AI and technology problems. One colleague, a younger colleague, but now he's a very senior guy in his own right, is Don Wunsch at Missouri Science and Technology. I guess at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. Don visited us as a young man, a student, and he got fascinated with art and related models like mine. I mean, I've been lucky to have a number of people early on who fell in love with it. Like, I don't know if you know who Robert Heck Nielsen was. Robert used to work in a company in California, and he would fly to have lunch with me when I was still at MIT, and we talked about neural networks. And he founded a company which was originally called Heck-Nielsen Neurocomputer, and then it became HNC Corporation. Then it got eaten by a bigger corporation. But, his whole reason for getting in technology was I inspired him when he was doing his PhD work. He's been dead for a while. It's sad. He died of a heart attack. So I've been very lucky that, some such pioneering souls were inspired by another pioneering soul. But there were a lot of vested interests who would wish I'd go away because either they didn't have the preparation to compete, although I don't think of it in those terms, or they were so in love with what they were currently doing that they wanted any concept that theirs wasn't the best game in town to go bye-bye.
Yeah.
So
when you look at this thought experiment and you delve into the dynamical systems, the mathematical processes you're talking about, it's very clear and it's easy to see how this sort of makes sense when you think of consciousness as a verb rather than a noun, or something that's constantly happening rather than just one single thing. I mean, it's very intuitive, but yet it takes such a complicated theory to explain the situation. Tell me about the cognitive emotional motor and how combining it with art leads to fascinating results on consciousness as well as our understanding of mental health and mental illness.
Okay, that's a big question too, but when I like it, I hope I do justice. So this so-called cognitive emotional motor model, or CogEM model, it can also be derived from a thought experiment. And I've used it to explain a lot of data about how cognition or thinking and emotion or feeling interact in order to choose actions. That's why it's a cognitive emotional motor model, actions that'll realize valued goals, because art by itself has no concept of values. You need emotions, feelings to direct your thoughts to valued goals, worthwhile goals. And so at this point, I like distinguishing 6 different kinds of adaptive resonances that I've studied. They support different aspects of consciousness, you were saying, that's what's triggering this thought, with different functions in different parts of our brains. So I'll start with cognitive emotional resonances. So not surprisingly, they support conscious feeling of emotions and also knowing their source. Oh, I love that person, the feeling and the target of the feeling. But then there are 5 others. This is not exhaustive. It's just what I've managed to do with colleagues. They're what I call surface-shroud resonances, which I'll explain in a moment, support conscious seeing of visual objects and scenes. Then there are the feature category resonances. This is what the original art is about. That supports conscious recognition of visual objects and scenes. So seeing and recognition are different. Yes. So, seeing or hearing or any percept is general purpose. You open your eyes, you see. Someone makes a sound, you hear. Recognition requires prior learning. It's not general purpose. So all that time, the feature category resonances of art were about conscious recognition. And it didn't say a thing about seeing. Then there are stream shroud resonances that support conscious hearing of auditory objects and streams. They're what I call the spectral pitch and timbre resonances that support conscious recognition of auditory objects and streams, including things like music. And there are the item list resonances that support conscious recognition of speech and language. And these are the foundational kind of resonances that are really used big time in the prefrontal cortex in organizing sequences of thoughts and beliefs and actions. So I already said perception is general purpose. You have it in response to both familiar and unfamiliar events, but recognition is only to familiar things you've already learned about. So one must never conflate them. So now about mental health, I just have very sketchy things here. It's such a huge topic. Well, first, I think it's really useful to have brain theories that explain a lot of facts about normal or typical behavior. Because it's only when such processes get imbalanced or damaged in certain ways that the behavior is no longer typical. And if it gets imbalanced enough to lead to symptoms that people find not very sociable, then we'll call it a mental disorder. Mm-hmm. So I was led through the back door, just like with consciousness, into mental disorders by noticing, hey, if the following processes and cognitive emotional dynamics get imbalanced, symptoms of Alzheimer's or autism or amnesia or post-traumatic stress disorder, etc., pop out. So it was the gift that keeps on giving, but that gift just opens the door to you. Then you have to start doing the hard work of justifying your leap by explaining and predicting really hard data, which I did with a number of students in various papers. And a theme in a lot of the work, not the only design theme, is one of opponent processes, which I model using a ubiquitously occurring circuit that I call a gated dipole. Dipole, they're opponent on and off cells that are competing. And the gates are transmitters, chemical transmitters. These are like the medium-term memories I earlier mentioned that can habituate if you use them. And that can cause all sorts of fascinating explanations. So, for example, a gated dipole, let's say I turn on a shock and you're a poor pigeon, you're in a Skinner box, the floor is electrified, and you're running around frantically trying to keep your feet off the floor to minimize the pain, trying to escape, and you accidentally bump into a red buzzer and the shock turns off. And you feel a wave of relief. So there's an antagonistic rebound between pain and fear and relief. And relief is a positive motivation that you can use to do many positive activities, including it's one of the foundations for the relaxation response in yoga, but you can use it to learn an escape reaction. So if the shock turns on again, you can look toward the buzzer and run to it to shut the shock off for escape and avoidance. So these opponent processes are very important. And the question is, what is the energy source that enables relief to be triggered? Because after all you did was shut off the shock. So the input to the fear center is off. Well, it could just have gone quiet and you did nothing. You just slump over. But there is an arousal source to both the on and off channel that tonically arouses them. And when they're just being aroused because they're competing, they have no output. And if there is a fearful cue coming in, it upsets the balance, so you get an on response, and you feel fear and pain. And when you shut the fearful input off, now you have arousal, but because of the medium-term memory in the on channel, it habituated, that transmitter got weaker. So the net input to the on channel is now less than the unhabituated input to the off channel, which triggers a rebound of relief. And that's transient because during that relief rebound, the transmitter to the off channel also habituates until they're equal again. And so you get a transient rebound. Otherwise, if you didn't have that habituation or medium-term memory, you'd be feeling tonic relief forever and your life would be very different. So the problem is, how do you choose the arousal level?
Yeah.
There has to be a kind of golden mean in the middle. It's just enough arousal to activate a rebound, but not too much arousal. And I, without explaining, there's simple things I could tell you, but everything would take too long then. If you have too little arousal, you have a kind of under-aroused depression. And then in response to a bigger than normal input, you can be hypersensitive. That's the paradox. And you can get that in ADHD, for example. And if you're over-aroused, then you always have enough arousal, but you're very insensitive. You're hyposensitive to inputs. You could get that in schizophrenia, for example. Very insensitive. Anyway, so, and those predictions, I hope I didn't say it wrongly, have been supported by subsequent experiments, precisely as I predicted them. Then there are very other different things, like when you're learning in art, I didn't talk about complementary computing, or the fact there's an attentional system where you're learning categories, and then there's an orienting system, which is sensitive to novelty and lets you reset your attentional focus if something new happens or if you're searching for a better answer. And the question is, how sensitive is your novelty system? And it turns out there's a parameter in art called vigilance. And, if your vigilance isn't working well or breaks down entirely, that's one of the things that can go wrong in Alzheimer's and autism. And, after a number of years of doing vigilance control simulations and explanations with Gail Carpenter and John Merrill and some other people, Max Versace and I in 2008 were able to show how the nucleus basalis of Minard responds to mismatches, giving you an arousal burst into layer 5 across major parts of cerebral cortex and releases acetylcholine, and that can cause a reset. And if the tonic and phasic vigilance controls is not tuned right, you can have big problems with mental disorders. But, I make that statement, but to explain it, we'd be here till the cows come home.
I think, yeah.
But
understand.
But I do, having mentioned surface-shroud resonances, I think it's an opportunity to comment about why there's a link, for example, between conscious seeing and looking and reaching, or between conscious hearing and communication and speaking, and so on. So let me go right into the surface-shroud resonances, whereby we consciously see visual objects and scenes explain why I think that's true, and some of the facts behind it, and why the conscious seeing is used to control action. And we'll start at the retina, the photosensitive retina. That's where light is registered in an eye. And then the light-activated signals from the retinal cells that are all over the back of the eye, they come together in axons or pathways, and they're bundled together into the optic nerve so they can go up to the brain and give you spatially patterned signals like it's a face, it's a painting. So it goes up to the optic nerve to the brain. But that's why the retina has the big blind spot.
Yes.
A spot where visual signals aren't registered, because that's the place on the retina where you're forming the optic nerve. And you might say, big deal, who cares? Well, no light's registered positions of the blind spot, but the blind spot, if you look down on a retinal image, as big as the fovea.
Yeah.
And the fovea is the part of the retina which we have our high visual acuity, and we do a few saccadic eye movements every second, is to point our fovea to the objects that interest us so that we can really see them. So the bottom line is we could not look at or reach for an object that happened to be registered on our retinas at the position of the blind spot without further processing. But that could lead to disaster, because it's as big as your fovea, where you do all your important visual processing. So you have to ask, why aren't we aware of the missing visual signals through the blind spot? And how do we complete the retinal representation so that you can look and reach for objects in these positions? And here, you can only marvel at the beauty of our design, because one fact that people may not know is that even though we think, if I'm looking at you as a stationary image, I think everything's stationary, but no, my eye is jiggling very rapidly in the orbit. And these jiggling movements are refreshing signals that I'm getting from stationary objects so that I can keep seeing you. Otherwise, you would fade. You'd have Ganzfeld. And this transient signals that are going in response to this jiggle are refreshing the visual signals so you can see. And did you see Jurassic Park?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was a very funny example of this, because at a certain point, there's the ravenous T-Rex looming over the guy, and they hollered him, "Stand still. You can't see unless there's relative motion." But of course, the T-Rex just moved its head, saw him, and devoured him in one big bite. So, so even with a refresh, you still have an incomplete retinal image with a big hole in it.
Yes.
And how is that image completed?
And just
here I could
both eyes as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, in both eyes. Yeah, I just want. I want to talk about one thing at a time, but it's happening in both eyes. We have two big holes. And you complete the retinal image of the blind spot higher up in our cortex by multiple stages of what I call boundary completion and surface filling in. Because I've shown that 3D boundaries and surfaces properly understood are the functional units of conscious vision. And I can't give you now a whole theory of how boundaries and surfaces are formed, but I can say that the process whereby incomplete boundary and surface representations are completed takes multiple processing stages, which I like to call a hierarchical resolution of uncertainty. There are principles of uncertainty, complementarity, and resonance in our brains. This is one of the uncertainty principles. And if you think about physics, lots of physical theories, notably quantum theory, have principles of uncertainty, complementarity, and resonance. And so you are fascinated by the question of, well, how are our principles related, if at all, to the principles in the physical world with which our ancestors have ceaselessly interacted while our brains were evolving? And that is a question for the next generation. Okay, but how does the brain know at what stage of this hierarchical resolution of uncertainty the cortical surface representation is complete enough to control looking and reaching? Turns out, I believe that happens in pre-stride cortical area V4. Remember, there's V1, V2, V3, A, V4. And I claim that a resonance with a completed surface representation in V4 and the next processing stage in posterior parietal cortex lights up the surface representation, chooses it, and renders it consciously visible. And you're going to use the consciously seen surface to control looking and reaching, not the partial crap in all the previous stages. And moreover, that the spatial attention from posterior parietal cortex to V4 fits itself to the shape of the surface. It forms a kind of shroud around it. An attentional shroud, with Christopher Tyler named a shroud, but he was thinking of a different thing. So I call this a surface shroud resonance. Lights up the surface, makes it visually conscious, and that's used for looking and reaching via the posterior parietal cortex. So top down, from PPC to V4, you have spatial attention that forms the shroud that enables the surface shroud resonance to occur. But when it's resonating bottom up from PPC to the rest of the brain, it's known it helps regulate looking and reaching. So PPC is an interface between conscious seeing and action. So I call it, this resonance, is surface shroud resonance, because the spatial attention that lights up the surface fits it to the shape of the surface like a shroud. And the surface shroud resonance supports conscious seeing. And the shroud in PPC, whose shape is now mirroring the surface, knows where to direct signals to look and reach, but you have to solve a number of coordinate change problems to do it, because you're looking in head center coordinates, you're reaching in body center coordinates. And with colleagues like Dan Bullock and Doug Grieve and Frank Gunther, we spend a lot of work showing how we self-organize these coordinate representations in bodies whose relationships between eyes and neck and shoulder are continually changing during our lives.
Steve, with regards to that, sorry to interrupt, have you guys thought about how unexpected visual cues might interact or disrupt this process?
Well, yeah, I focused so much on the art attentional system for learning, but an unexpected cue will mismatch ongoing processing. If there's a big enough mismatch, it'll activate the orienting system, which is either, depending on the part of the brain, and or hippocampal region or non-specific thalamic region. And then you'll get a burst of non-specific arousal, a novelty reaction, And that will drive a search for a better matching category. So if, for example, an unexpected but familiar category comes in, there would be a quick reset and a shift of attention would occur to the right category in one step. There's no generalized search. But if there were no
Familiarity.
If there were no familiar category, if it was really novel, there'd be a brief search, but when there was nothing nearby, the system is designed to choose an uncommitted population and begin learning a new category.
Okay.
And so, yes, there's the processes of attention, the attentional and orienting systems in art are computationally complementary. And let me just leave it at that. And you can, it's not such a deep thing, but you can go through a few properties of each and you could see they're manifestly complementary. They fit together like yin fits together with yang, or puzzle pieces fit together. And that's one of the beautiful things. So many of the processes I've understood are computationally complementary, like yin yang.
Yes.
And I think of them as emerging in early development as a kind of global symmetry breaking in morphogenesis, which I don't fully understand. I've written down some of the targets of morphogenesis. I've also written some, basic but incomplete papers about early development with various students. But to fully explain the unfolding of these complementary systems will need a lot of very productive work. So it's another big unsolved problem for the new generation.
Steve, tell me, how do these neural models combine to explain how we could design autonomous adaptive intelligence into algorithms and mobile robots for engineering, technology, and just artificial intelligence in general?
Okay, so, and this will, I think, give you a little of the greater detail you wanted. So all the neural models that I've discovered and developed and illustrated operate autonomously. And the ones that learn can learn unsupervised, just in response to inputs from the world, or supervised, where you can, the supervision is provided by feedback about predictive success in the world. Like, I look at a letter that I think is a letter E because it has, two things and a little thing at the bottom. And my teacher says, no, it's an F. And so, that she doesn't have to go further. Just through examples like that, I can realize that, ignore that little thing on the bottom. So all the perceptual and cognitive processes, and this is the point, are designed to be general purpose, meaning they can respond to any input pattern in their particular domain and respond adaptively to these general purpose inputs in changing environments. And that is, I want to emphasize a work in progress, of course. But let me illustrate the power of what we do know by noting that what I call the paradigm of laminar computing, which clarifies how multiple parts of the brain can interact seamlessly together because they're designed as variations of a single canonical cortical circuit, even though they may be doing vision, recognition, speech, language, just by fine-tuning a canonical circuit. And so I'll jump ahead and say, think about what that means for the future of technology. Of course, you could have one canonical VLSI chip. And if you do the variations of that chip that do vision, speech, language, whatsoever, cognition, because it's the same chip, you can connect it all in a self-consistent, increasingly autonomous system. It all fits together. It's the same architecture repeated over and over. And to put in perspective, the cerebral cortex, the little gray cells of Hercule Poirot, is the seat of all higher intelligence in all modalities. And remarkably, let me emphasize, variations of a single canonical cortical circuit gives rise to all higher order biological intelligence as emergent or interactive properties of how several cortical areas interact together. So the cells in cerebral cortex are organized in layers, usually in perceptual or cognitive cortex 6, main layers with characteristic sublamina. And the lamina computing model explains how this lamina design unifies. And here's where it's very important for the future of natural intelligence computing, unifies the best properties of feed-forward and feedback processing, digital and analog processing, bottom-up pre-attentive data-driven processing, like our adaptive filters, and top-down attentive hypothesis-driven processing, like our learned expectations. And if it could be embodied in a VLSI chip suitably specialized to embody these different intelligent capabilities, we can move toward general purpose, autonomous adaptive intelligence. And because they're chips, they can go in everything from algorithms and machines to mobile robots because they're light. It'll take a big, big effort. And Google seems to be fascinated by deep learning. But if Google wants to make trillions of dollars, if they do it right, this is where the revolution is. The revolution is in autonomy, not in semi-classical steepest descent that goes back to Friedrich Gauss. So as I said, there are 6 main layers in all cortical areas that support vision, object recognition, speech, language, and cognition. The layers are a little different in action areas. And they interact, the layers interact in a single design for bottom-up, horizontal, and top-down pathways. I've been talking mostly about bottom-up and top-down, but we need horizontal too. So as I earlier stated, the bottom-up pathways are adaptive filters that carry out the learning of recognition categories. And the top-down are expectations that learn to focus attention on the critical features, the ones that you're paying attention to that control predictive success. But the horizontal interactions between multiple cortical columns link cells into groupings that carry out different functions across the brain. And remember, I mentioned boundaries and surfaces earlier. Well, such horizontal interactions are what enable us to form perceptual boundaries around objects with a kind of cell that I introduced called a bipole cell. And anyway, so how the neocortical cells interact within and across layers is what the autonomous adaptive intelligence problem reduces to in this canonical cortical circuit. So it's a clearly defined problem for which there's immense amount of compatible data. In particular, I love to say that a pre-attentive grouping, like a boundary, which can form automatically even before you pay attention to it, is the difference between perception and recognition. A pre-attentive grouping is its own attentional prime due to the way in which horizontal and feedback interact within the laminar circuits. Anyway, I think that's all I want to say about that, except chapter 10 of my Magnum Opus, which I haven't mentioned. I should mention it because it's called Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind. It was published in 2021 by Oxford University Press, and it tries to give a self-contained and non-technical overview and synthesis of not only my work and hundreds of collaborators over the past 50 some odd years, but also explains and unifies the understanding of the work of hundreds of other scientists. It's not just about me. And I'm happy to say that the book won the 2022 Prose Book Award in Neuroscience of the Association of American Publishers. And if you look it up on Amazon, you'll see it's dirt cheap. It's almost 800 pages with over 600 color figures. The Kindle is just $17, and the hard copy is just $33, because I spent thousands of dollars of my own money to make it affordable, especially to young people like students. And as to being self-contained and non-technical, it's not an easy read because this is the most complex system we can study.
Yes.
But I have friends who are a rabbi, a pastor, a visual artist, a gallery owner, a social worker, a lawyer who know no science, who've enjoyed reading parts of it. And I say parts of it because I know it's a long book and everyone's busy. And if you read the introduction and preface, you can then jump to any chapter you like, because I wrote the chapters to be readable independently of each other. And if you want to read more about art, you'd read chapter 5. If you want to read more about how we consciously see, you'd read chapters 1 through 3.
I think that was a very good approach to the book as well, Steve, because I remember when I was doing my dissertation, because I read your book once before, and then I remember while working later on, anytime I wanted to figure out something about a specific topic, I was able to jump to that specific chapter. So that approach is not just, it's very effective, almost like having a little dictionary for the mind.
Well, in the hype, it's called Principia of Mind, just like Newton had his own Principia. But
and it's
anyway, I worked very hard on it, and I think it came out pretty well, given the challenge of writing it. So you want me to go through the thought experiment?
Yeah, I think let's do that. Let's go through that. I mean, this thought experiment it's amazing. So run me through the thought experiment of how any system can autonomously learn to correct predictive errors in a changing world that is filled with unexpected events.
And let me thank you for reading my work so carefully. You used my very words.
Well, this was from our email, so I just found it a lot easier.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
A lot easier to do.
Fair is fair. Fair is fair. So there are multiple steps in the thought experiment, and I can't do them all here. I can, however, mention that the main ideas are very, very simple. And there are two questions that drive the thought experiment. And they all have to do with principle of sufficient reason. It's all an exercise in pure logic. And it's a celebration of the role of reason in scientific theorizing. The first question is, how can a coding error be corrected if no individual cell knows that one has occurred? You know, cells are idiots, and von Neumann realized that. Von Neumann commented on the fact that brain cells individually are pretty stupid. How do you get this collective intelligence? And the second point is symbols or compressed categories, that respond selectively to stuff. By themselves, they can't detect errors. They don't know if what activated them was right or wrong. So then how do you correct errors? And that drives you to top-down expectations, because you have to see, is what's going on down there what was going on down there when you learned the category? So it's very simple-minded. And so these trivial statements gain their power from the logical story that is a thought experiment. It's a celebration of logic and science. So that's all I really want to say about that. I think people,
Sorry.
If people don't want to buy the book, if you look at my 1980 paper in Psychological Review, I have that and over 500 papers on my webpage, which is sites, that's SITES .bu for Boston University, .edu for education, /Steve G, STEVEG. If you go to sites.bu.edu/Steve G, that's my webpage. There are hundreds of papers. 1980, you can download my Psychological Review paper for free. You don't have to pay $17 for my book.
I'll put the link.
And there are all of those papers there, as well as many videos of keynote lectures and interviews. And I hope I can put this on my webpage eventually.
I'd appreciate that, and I'll definitely put a link to that website in the description as well, Steve. Steve, I've got something I've been thinking about. As a kid, when you think about people like Bayes and Bayesian predictive brains, this is not in the schedule, but it's something I'm curious about. At what point were you thinking, like, this predictive approach, this hierarchical Bayesian brain approach, just does not suffice for me?
Well, remember, I did ART, which is a predictive theory, starting in 76, and all of the fad-like interest in the Bayes rule was much later. And, the Bayes rule as used in a statistical estimation is a valid approach. But what is the Bayes rule? It's the probability of two events, A and B, written in two ways. The probability of B given A times the probability of A, or the probability of A given B times the probability of B. It's just a tautology. Take that equality between those two ways of probability A given B times probability of B equal probability of B given A times probability of A, and divide, let's say, both sides by probability of A and maximize. That's the Bayes rule. It's a tautology, but it's used in statistical estimation. Some of my good friends are good statisticians who've used it. But it says nothing about the world. It's just a tautology. Anything that you want to say about in physics or chemistry or biology or mind and brain, you've got to add. You'll notice I don't think it's used in physics or chemistry or biology. And there's nothing in the heuristics of the Bayes rule that suggests what to add. And that's when people just start throwing in the kitchen sink and trying to fit it to what is basically just a tautology. I just think that's sad, given that people like me and hundreds of other people emulating, developing, varying, improving. It's all over the literature. Why are you doing this? It's trying to get something for nothing. You want to turn the magical lever and you'll get out more than you put in. There's a difference between the gift that keeps on giving when you have foundations that are already explanatory and predictive, and getting something for nothing when you don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Mm.
In fact, I'll give you an old example of that. Do you know who René Thom was?
Yes.
Catastrophe theory. Well, I was invited to a big conference about catastrophe theory, and they invited me because, I was already the preeminent model of mind and brain. And I was sharing an office with a young mathematician, and he literally said to me, "Isn't it wonderful that by knowing the elementary catastrophes, I can write about biology, but I don't have to learn any biology?" It was really a case, he said it, he's a very intelligent young man, case of trying to get something for nothing. And then, Thom would make sweeping statements about applying, it to this or that or the other thing. And I had a chat with him. So I said, he was interested. I think maybe it was language or something. So one of my early loves was understanding verbal learning. And so I asked him, well, how would you, for example, explain the Bode serial position curve in serial verbal learning? First, he never heard of it, but he said, I don't care about data. He said that to me. I don't care about data. You'd never know it from hearing him talk. Anyway, so that was very, very sad, I thought. But he was a great differential geometer. It's just he reached a certain age and he wanted to become a philosopher king. I think he would have been better if he tempered his work to see. He had postulates that were really good for things like turbulence. He should have just left well enough alone, because mind-brain has nothing to do with his postulates for the elementary catastrophes.
I think. I mean, you clearly are different in that way. I mean, you're very much a polymath in that regard. When you think about you being an emeritus professor, it's in so many different fields. When you see your bio is going to be quite a lengthy one when I put it down.
It's because of the universality of the subject matter that I've illustrated.
Mm.
I've been led sometimes kicking and screaming into areas I never thought I'd know anything about, including consciousness. I've been forced into these fields by the power of the theory.
Mm.
And I feel very lucky to have been put in that position. But, I do think that I've been true to the data.
Mm.
I'm not a slavish reductionist by any means, but I believe that the majesty of evolution, including of our minds, provides us with a richness that we just have to do the best we can,
Mm. Is it rewarding to know? I mean, you've had it out for such a long time, and you can see how it's been applied and practically used at this point. How does it feel to see it continuously grow and
well, I love it when you tell me things like that, and I occasionally notice things like that. But I notice just as often young investigators who know nothing about the work working on similar problems. And I think the problem is that all too often today, investigators might think they only need to read the last 5 years of research, or maybe if they're real scholars, 10 years. But I made some of these discoveries 30, 40, 50 years ago, and they're still holding.
Yeah.
And And I think that's okay. No one can know everything. But, if I see someone's making a claim that is particularly irksome because I worked so hard to explain it much better than they were even doing now, I'll write them a polite and friendly letter saying, hey, you might be interested in knowing this result. And then that's where you can tell a person's mettle. If they write back and even say, well, thank you very much, I'll read it. Thanks for calling my attention to it. That's the most you can hope for.
Yes.
But if they just choose to ignore it, then, you're dealing with a plagiarist.
Yes.
So a lot of doing science is having good values. I felt that I have to keep my emotions pure, so I don't do things that are not intellectually valid because of, petty emotions.
And I think you're in a difficult position because when you're so focused on the work, I mean, you've said this numerous times as well, but when you're so focused on doing the work, moving on to the next step and trying to get onto the next field, you're not really self-promoting as much as other scientists would.
So that's right. Like Teivo Kohonen,
yes.
who, people credit with self-organizing map. Well, no, I did it before him.
Yes.
And so did Christoph von der Malsberg, and I worked on in the mid-70s, and Teivo started writing about it in 82 and 84. And I was the session chair where he presented his work. And in the discussion period, I wrote down his claims against things I'd already published, point by point, and he ignored it.
Yeah.
And this is a man.
I feel so.
I even helped him. I helped him get a big promotion by the government of Finland. Even after he did that, and I think, what an asshole I am. He wasn't worthy of it because of his ethics.
Are there anything?
But it was all he ever did, and I had moved on.
Steve,
and so that's a problem. I can't defend all my children.
Yes.
They're out in the world.
But while you're here, are there any other pieces of work or bodies of work that you have that you feel should be brought up, that you have taught the world before someone else? Or do you want to just go on to the next question? I know we're going off track a little.
Well, I can.
Because
why don't we?
For someone who's.
Why don't we quickly? Let's try to speed up.
Okay, cool. Let's go on to the next question.
Ask me about, creativity.
How do our brains? Yes. How do our brains support such vital human qualities such as creativity, morality, and religion? And why do so many people persist in superstitious, irrational, and self-defeating behaviors in certain social environments?
Okay, so here I'm going to quote my Magnum Opus, page 14. So I have to read it. Examples of cognitive emotional interactions ubiquitous. For example, few of us would say that the wallpaper on a dining room wall causes food to appear on the dining room table, even though it's present whenever food is served. On the other hand, if you went into the dining room only when food was served, you might very well associate the distinctive wallpaper in the dining room with eating. If you walk through the room between meals, you won't do that. In fact, many superstitious societal rituals, such as rain dances or primitive medical practices that may do more harm than good, may have arisen throughout history due to accidental correlations between events. Even a low probability of reward can, under the proper circumstances, lead some people to indulge in superstitious behaviors, maintain unhealthy relationships, become chronic gamblers, or even pursue fetishistic and self-punitive behaviors. And my book says a bit how, but so the main issue is, how do we learn which events are causal and which are accidental? And like the cognitive emotional work on reinforcement learning helps us to focus attention on those combinations of events that predict valued goals and the other events that are outliers and are predictably irrelevant. And that's really all about how you explain attentional blocking, which goes back to Ivan Pavlov. So I explained how that works. So we can go on to painters. Want to go on to painters?
Yeah.
Or do you want to ask me a question?
This question was from Ogi. Yeah, Ogi Ogas.
Oh, so you know Ogi. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So we spoke about when we spoke.
So he's the one.
Best.
He's one of the people who says I'm the smartest guy ever.
He says you are the greatest scientist in history. He goes on a limb of all time, not just living.
Such totality statements are always risky, always, no matter what the subject. Anyway, but I love it. I appreciate it. I hope it's partly true. Okay, let's put it that way.
I mean,
okay,
so he said he says he knows you love talking about art, and he knows you like talking about art and painters when you talk about the mind. Maybe you could share one of your favorite examples of how your research illuminates a particular painting.
Okay, so I'll give you a very short answer. I like to say that Henri Matisse, whose work I love, knew that all boundaries are invisible. Indeed, there are many percepts that we recognize by completing invisible boundaries. I haven't explained why boundaries are invisible in the boundary stream. Visibility, conscious visibility is a property of surfaces, which we have discussed a little. And, an example of completion of invisible boundaries in order to understand an object, do you know the famous examples of a Dalmatian in snow, where all you have, Dalmatian has big black spots and the rest of its coat's white. And if you see it in a background of white snow, when you first look at it, it just looks like black blotches. But after a little while, invisible boundaries form between the black blotches that give you enough of a percept of the shape of the Dalmatian. So you recognize the Dalmatian in snow. So that's this sort of thing. And that's a serious ability, to deal with invisible boundaries. Like it helps to escape predators. If you have, a predator running in light dappled, partially camouflaged environments, boundary completion can let you recognize and see the predator before it's too late. And so Matisse had many paintings based on the observer's brain completing invisible boundaries to recognize what's going on. Some of my favorites he published in 1905 when he was a young man. So that's what I wanted to say about that. I could go on and on. My book, in the part of my book where I discuss visual, how we see, I'm really fascinated by how artists make paintings and how humans consciously see paintings. And I discussed the work of, I think it was 14 different artists, including Matisse and Monet and Rembrandt, and my mind is not focusing. And what the instinctive discoveries they made about how our minds consciously see that enable them to develop a personal style that emphasize some processes rather than others. And I like talking about style from that perspective, going on into the mechanism.
Sorry, Steve, you want to continue?
No, I'm done. I'm done. Yeah.
What do you think about Ogi and Tsai's work? I mean, continuing your work. I mean, they really.
Oh, I don't do that. I don't talk about other people.
Okay.
No, it's not fair. If I said something wonderful and you read it and don't like it,
I see. Okay.
You feel annoyed. And if I say it's lousy and you don't read it and you would have liked it, it's a no-win situation. So I think people who are interested in the topic they're writing on should read the book.
Okay.
Should read it. But, I don't evaluate other people's work in public. And in fact, I was an editor-in-chief for many years, and my job was to choose reviewers who shouldn't be prejudiced for or against work, but who should be informed about the background. And if 3 reviewers had a similar opinion, I supported their decision.
Okay.
Wasn't for me to say. So, if the reviewers of Ogie and Sai's book like the book, that's the review. Respond.
Sorry, Steve. I was actually just asking in general their approach of taking your work even further and trying to promote it.
I love it when people do that.
Yeah,
I do.
No, I wasn't asking for a review of the book, actually.
No, there's nothing more fulfilling to an old man than to have people think your work is useful enough to spend their time trying to do more or improve, develop, whatever.
Okay.
Let's see. So you wanted to ask about challenges or criticisms?
So what challenges or criticisms has the theory faced since its inception, and how have you addressed them? You can go through the major ones that come to mind.
So I'll give you a 3-part answer. So I've usually been far ahead of my audience in anticipating problems that I have not yet solved, and then solving them before other people realized they were even problems, like the stability-plasticity dilemma, which still has not been solved by deep learning or backpropagation. So that avoided criticism because no one even knew what the hell I was doing. That was in the early years. I got challenges from people who didn't understand my work, and they wanted to push their product as long as they can to criticize it so people would read their work, which was usually weaker. But then their work would fade away and mine wouldn't.
Were there any aspects of it that anybody who really stumped you or really got you to think about it differently?
I live in the data. If someone would show me, first, I'm always reading data. At this stage of my life, I'll often read data and I'll say, oh, that's just this or that's just that. And I could see, to write a paper on it, it's a lot of effort, but I know what the data means. If I see effect, which is very unusual now, that I don't know what the hell is going on, I am consumed. It will own me until I can put it in a context where I can explain it. So that's just the way I operate. It's not what people say about it. I know the evidence for my models, and I know they're incomplete. But if I see something that's qualitatively outside the range, and it's something that interests me, I will passionately commit myself to understanding more. Sometimes the database is just too small.
Yes.
It could, and it might not even be a fact. You need really to study whole databases. You need enough evidence, because anybody can try to explain one fact in 20 ways.
That's true.
Try to explain 100 facts in one way. That's where the challenge is. It's trying to see how all the constraints can be harmoniously resolved.
Yeah. Are there any recent development or extensions of the theory that you find particularly exciting? And how do you envision?
Well, I don't know if I posted it on Connectionist, CVNet, and LinkedIn, but just a few days ago, an article that I really like a lot, and it represents a synthesis of many of my earlier discoveries. Everything is integrative. And the title is How Children Learn to Understand Language Meanings, a neural model of adult-child multimodal interactions in real time. And I'll say a little more about that, but what's very much in the news now is ChatGPT, which is just a big lookup table where people have thrown in millions of tidbits and facts, and then you add on a probabilistic algorithm to try to predict the next 5 words after the last 5 words. Has no concept of meaning. But I'm discussing meaning, and I'll read the abstract to you in a minute. And last year I wrote an article I liked very much toward understanding the brain dynamics of music, learning and conscious performance of lyrics and melodies with variable rhythms and beats. And that is on my webpage, site.bu.edu/SteveG, for anyone who wants to look at it. I do everything open access these days. And it shows, this whole, in addition to explaining data about musical lyrics and melodies and rhythms and beats, it also shows how this competence really co-ops previously existing foundational capabilities. It's like, why do we move to the beat?
Yeah.
Things like that get explained. And before that, as I've indicated with the discussion of Matisse and other artists, I did stuff on how visual artists make paintings and how humans consciously see them. So, I'm very into these, triumphs of our civilization, of the human spirit. Let me read you the abstract about meanings, if you indulge me.
Yeah, for sure.
This article describes a biological neural network model that can be used to explain how children learn to understand language meanings about the perceptual and affective events that they consciously experience. So I've talked about perception. I've talked about cognitive emotional dynamics. I need that. This kind of learning often occurs when a child interacts with an adult teacher to learn language meanings about events that they experience together. And here's really the bottom line. Multiple types of self-organizing brain processes are involved in learning language meanings, including processes that control conscious visual perception, joint attention, object learning and conscious recognition, cognitive working memory, cognitive planning, emotion, cognitive emotional interactions, volition, and goal-oriented actions. So these are all things that were there, but I could synthesize. That's how an old man stays productive. The article shows how all these brain processes interact to enable learning language meanings to occur, and it contrasts these human capabilities with AI models like ChatGPT. And to emphasize that contrast, they call my model Chat, SOME, Chatsome, where SOME abbreviates self-organized meaning. So
nice. I actually saw you on LinkedIn. I was meant to watch it, but I was at work. I was meant to actually read that paper.
Well, thank you. I hope some people do.
You posted it yesterday.
Well, I think I posted it on Monday
I saw it on
yesterday.
LinkedIn. I think it was yesterday or the day before.
Yeah, I might have posted it a day or so ago. Over 2,000 people have seen it.
Yeah.
Which is nice.
Yeah. Now, I'm definitely looking forward to that as well. And I'll also share it as well. Tell me, Steve, after we conclude with this final question, I have a few more, but your overall vision
That's okay.
and hope for the study of mind in the future, and your message to future philosophers and scientists joining the field.
So I have two initial thoughts. First, read the published literature.
Mhm.
In the age of Google, there's no excuse for trying to rediscover the wheel or not to put to find a point on it. You don't want to waste a lot of your life just plagiarizing because it won't really help you in the long run. And if you want to understand the latest theoretical concepts and models about how brain makes mind, and certainly include in your reading work that I and my colleagues have done. And I wrote the Magnum Opus, Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes Mind. Because a lot of people say, you know, I love your work, but it's scattered all over the place. Now you have at least that as a synthesizing. And then if you want details, archival articles, I have over 560 archival papers on my webpage. And I have, videos of keynote lectures I've given about this and that, all of which I try to make as self-contained as possible. And then the second point, which I think for young people is very important, is find a problem you're passionate about, one that you're willing to spend the hundreds of hours that you're going to need to learn and think about anything if you're going to make any progress at all. And not everyone is going to be passionate about a problem on mind and brain or indeed in science. Well, then don't become a theorist. Don't become an experimentalist. For example, if you still like reading stuff in science or other areas, one noble profession is teaching, which is a very satisfying profession. I always loved to teach. And there are already innumerable productive careers you can carry out that aren't in academia. Whoever you are, our troubled world needs your talents. So just try to do some good in the world. We're only here for a short time. Try to make it so, one concept of immortality is people will have positive thoughts about you being here for the brief time you were. So do good works.
That's wonderful advice, Steve. I mean, you've got an age index of around 130. You've been cited thousands of times. You continue to pump out work. I mean, what's the next step for you? What are you, or how old are you at the moment, and where are you headed? Like, what is the plan here? Because you just keep going.
Well, I am 83. My mom lived to 101, but I have serious asthma. So if my asthma doesn't kill me, there's no history of dementia in the family. If I don't get sick, I'll probably be productive for maybe 10 more years, who knows. What I'm doing now is writing another book for a general audience.
Is there anything you want to say about that book, or is that still just spoiler free?
No, I don't like talking about things I haven't yet done because I might not do them, Yeah, I might change my mind.
For sure.
I don't know. I'm fascinated writing the book. I'm enjoying it. But, if tomorrow, for some reason, something goes pop in my mind and I have another big idea and I say, God, I really got to follow this out, I'll drop the book and do that project if I can. Because I'm retired, I've been Emeritus since 2019. I no longer have big research grants, and along with that, I don't have to think of them and write them and get PhD students and postdocs and train them to work together. So I can work solo, but that means everything that I'm doing, I have to do with the foundation in place that's been built over 66 years. So far, the foundation's been very useful, like for the music work, the artwork, the meaning work. But I don't know what's going to happen next. I really don't. I love writing this book. it'll keep me busy if I'm brain dead for a new idea. But if I have an idea, I'll go for it.
And Steve, is
but
this
what I don't?
Sorry, continue.
Yeah. What I do, have to encumber myself. For example, I'm 83, so it's unfair to even think about taking on a graduate student or postdoc. That's at least a 3-year commitment.
Yes.
I could be dead in 3 years. It's not right. And I certainly am not interested in writing grants.
Tell me, Steve, is this
What?
Is this book specifically a way to explore new ideas, or is it something you want to clarify on and just add on old ones?
Well, it's a synthesis of things I already know. But, you know, a synthesis isn't just what you already know.
Especially in your,
it can be
so much information in store.
Yeah, so for me, it's like light reading. I'm enjoying it, but, you know, I try to be very careful with style and clarity and logical development of ideas. So we'll see how it goes. I don't know.
And one of the reasons when I started this podcast, Steve, was because when I went to school, university, etc., and I spoke about my favorite scientists and all these people who write amazing books and publish brilliant journals like yourself, a lot of people don't really know about these people. A lot of the times it's these are the people who they're not really talking about. And someone like you, in your case, even though you've been cited thousands of times, you're an emeritus professor, you've been given several awards, there's still so many things you're not recognized for. And this was a way to provide people with that platform to talk about those.
Well, that's true. You know, in fact, you were saying, I think, was around 83,000 citations. But if you look at the people who have been credited with a lot of the ideas I had first and developed, and you estimate how many citations they got from using my work, I would have 3 or 4 times that many citations.
Exactly.
But citations aren't the reason to work. You know, I'm in it for the long haul. I haven't hit a brick wall. And to avoid hitting a brick wall, you have to study problems rich enough and get enough evidence for dealing with them that they'll carry you to new and exciting ideas.
Do you feel there are any specific ideas that you felt were rightfully yours and you brought those models out first, or that you want to mention at all?
Well, I and Malzberg, although I did the correct version, did competitive learning. I introduced adaptive resonance theory. I've had many wonderful collaborators developing and still developing. I introduced the basic equations for on-center off-surround networks, which solve another dilemma, the noise saturation dilemma, and I had a thought experiment for that. Basically, if you look at my work, there are a few equations, fundamental equations. They're mine. I introduced them in 1957. I introduced the paradigm of nonlinear systems with differential equations to link brain to mind through neural networks in 1957. I introduced a somewhat larger number of modules on microcircuits. This is all on my Wikipedia page, if you ever read Stephen Grossberg Wikipedia. And for example, shunting on-center off-surround networks, recurrent and non-recurrent, they are used in multiple parts of the brain, including in walking, running, cognition, perception, emotion. It's a very foundational kind of circuit. And I've introduced all the basic modules very early on. And then what I do is I combine specialized versions of the microcircuits and the equations in what I call modal architectures, modal for different modalities, vision, audition, et cetera, et cetera. And that's my legacy, the equations, the modules, and the architectures in a word. That is the theory. That's how it's organized. Mm. And yeah, I've gotten partial credit for it, and I am grateful for it. And if you work for that, you'll never keep going, because the whole point is to be ahead of the game.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll do my best to at least provide some people with certain things, just to at least help you grow this knowledge, because I think people need to know.
I think they'd enjoy knowing.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, a lot of people who were drawn to my book have enjoyed reading parts of it. And you know, a lot of them who want to know about things they didn't think anyone knew about, they could just at least read titles and abstracts on my webpage. And then if they want to get into it, I always start a paper by talking about what is the big problem, what are the main facts, very non-technical. I always talk to my students about writing a paper that there's an exponential loss of readers with every sentence. So if you can't get all the main ideas of your paper into the first paragraph, you've lost it. Yeah. But then, of course, as I've indicated, after the simple heuristics, there's the tough demands of mathematical rigor. Equations don't lie.
I've personally seen your change over the years, because I've read a lot of your work, watched you for a long time as well. But you can see that as the years have gone by, you've become much better at being more self-contained and actually doing this. And it's testament to how much you actually know about the topic over these years and how much you've learned even more.
Well, the notion of self-contained also depends on what you know.
That's true.
Because I might think it's perfectly self-contained.
I find that.
But if you knew nothing about the field, you might say, what planet is this person coming from?
I think that's
But how long have you been interested in the mind? I have no idea.
So for me, it's been for as long as I can remember. I was first inspired to read about this when I read Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And I remember
he's a wonderful expositor.
Yeah, so I remember in that moment, just we're having this urge to learn about the mind, and it hasn't stopped since. But I still remember back in those days when I read some of your work, it was a period where I'd forgotten about it, and then slowly reintroduced myself to it, and realized how much better it was as an older man, I would say.
Well, my understanding of Oliver Sacks, real page turners about really fascinating topics, but doesn't really explain how anything works. So we might have a book about hallucinations,
yes,
but you have to come to me to understand how that happens.
Exactly.
And the same is true for any mental disorders that he might write about, And as I said, I didn't just say, today I'm going to understand autism or whatever. It sort of has to come out of the wash through the back door, has to be implied by what you've already done. And it opens a gateway to a new area. But I've been doing that for so long now. I've gone through maybe all the doors I'm ever going to go through. Who knows? Pretty big house.
Yeah. Tell me, Steve, I mean, we're obviously closing off, but who, growing up and doing this, I mean, who inspired you? Who were the people the scientists and philosophers in particular, that really got you going?
Well, I am a pioneer, and pioneers sort of come out of nowhere, but I was lucky. Well, first, I grew up in New York at a time when it was very hard for Jewish kids to get in college. There was a Jewish quota. So we worked super hard to get good enough scores on general tests and grades that we might get a scholarship to go to a good school. Of course, there was CCNY in New York, which was a wonderful school that a lot of poor kids whose parents were immigrants or they were immigrants themselves went to, and they became very often famous scholars and scientists. But I really wanted to get the hell out of New York. And so I went to Dartmouth because first they gave me the biggest scholarship, but second they had something they called a senior fellowship, which meant in your senior year, you could not take courses, you could just do research. Now, I didn't know what research was, but I did know that I really, really needed a year before I got out of college to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. So when I went to Dartmouth, as I indicated at the beginning, I took introductory psychology and my head exploded and I started making discoveries. But that could have led in a very different direction than it did. But luckily, I had two wonderful mentors. One is John Kemeny. Have you ever heard of John Kemeny? Well, he was Albert Einstein's last assistant.
Oh, wow.
He co-invented the basic computer language. He co-invented computer time-sharing systems. So he was very into computing. And having been so close to Einstein, he knew what it meant to be a loner. And he also wrote a wonderful book called A Philosopher Looks at Science. And I was lucky to take a course that read out of that book when I was a sophomore. And until that point, coming out of New York, where you're ranking, like at Stuyvesant, where I was valedictorian. I don't know if you've heard of Stuyvesant, but some people think being valedictorian at Stuyvesant is the hardest thing you'll ever do. But I was at a party after graduation, and a guy who was a little drunk came up to me. It was for, Stuyvesant and Bronx Science students. Said, "Are you Grossberg?" And I said, "Yeah, have we met?" And he said, "No, but I've hated you my whole time at Stuyvesant." I said, "Well, why'd you hate me?" He said, "Well, I wanted you to die because my grade, my ranking would go up by one. It was so competitive." Yeah. Around 92 point, up to the 100th decimal point, there were 700 students out of a class of 1,500. So 100th of a decimal point of your cumulative grade could mean you wouldn't get in any college.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
If you were a Jew, and most of us were Jews. Not most of the students are Asian.
And you were always first in your class. What? I said on top of that, you were always first in your class. I mean, this is
basically.
Yeah, a pattern.
So anyway, so I knew I had to stop learning to compete, which was a survival skill, and start learning out of love. And in my freshman year, I made my discoveries, and I took Kemeny's class as sophomore, and he wrote that I wrote the best essays he had ever read, without qualification. And in my introductory economics course, my final was so sensational, apparently, that my teacher said it was at the level of a PhD thesis. And my brother, who was at a different college, heard about it, which didn't make it easy for him to have me as a brother.
Imagine.
So I worked harder than you should ever work for knowledge. But and then my other mentor was Al Hasler, who was chairman of psychology. So I chairman of math, chairman of psychology. And Al went on to become a dean and provost at Stanford. He was a wonderful man. So those are the two pillars of my work, mathematics and psychology. And I became the first joint major in mathematics and psychology at Dartmouth. And in my senior fellowship year, I worked like a dog to further develop the discoveries I started making as a freshman.
Mm.
And then I tried to go to a place where they would let me keep working. And there were only two places in the world at the time that had programs in what was called mathematical psychology. But for example, the one closest to psychology was at Stanford. It was run by William Estes, who was a very great experimentalist. He did wonderful work on learning with B.F. Skinner in 1941, they published. Anyway, I thought, I can go there, they'll get me, but they didn't, because Bill was an experimentalist, never had math. So the best he could do was to develop an urn model, two urns.
Mm.
Can you hear?
It's getting slightly blurry.
Okay, I think. One sec. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah, my AirPods died. They
That's
ran out of
fun.
juice. An urn model, you have an urn with elements that are learned, an urn with elements that are forgotten. You talk about the probability of learning. You go from unlearned to learned, the probability of forgetting going from learned to unlearned. So we express this in terms of simple matrices. And that was as far as Bill could go. It was group data, stationary probabilities. And I walked in talking about real-time autonomous adaptation of individuals in a changing world. They didn't know what the hell to do with me. And anyway, there were a whole series of mishaps. So finally, there's another cute story. I ended up at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York, where I got my PhD for proving global limit theorems about learning and memory. And that was an accident. I was very unhappy at Stanford, so I wrote a letter to the Rockefeller Institute because I heard they were taking on some students. And the next thing I knew, they invited me to fly back to New York for an interview because they checked me out. And I would have gone anyway. I wanted to see my family. My parents live in Queens. And Rockefeller had a ton of money. And their trustees recommended, you've had a lot of Nobel laureates, now it's time to teach a new generation. And so my interview was, I had lunch with Mark Katz, KAC, a very famous probability theorist and functional analyst, a fellow Hungarian. And we had it in this amazing paneled room overlooking gardens with art and paintings on the walls, linen, silverware. Anyway, the main thing Mark told me was, Steve, never grow old. That was our interview.
Oh, really?
And then I was ushered in to the president's office. The president was Detlef Bronk, B-R-O-N-K, who whose family founded the Bronx, the borough of the Bronx in New York in colonial times. He had previously been president of Johns Hopkins. And I go into his fabulously, elegantly furnished office just as the sun is setting, casting dramatic shadows over the room. And he sits me on this lovely sofa and he looks me in the eye and he said, Steve, if we funded you, would you want to come to Rockefeller? That was my interview.
Oh, jeez.
And I said, yes. So
at what point did you realize, okay, you are definitely above the rest and kind of onto something seriously big?
I always knew I had a gift.
Mm.
In fact, when I was in public school, my friend said I was born with a golden spoon in my mouth because I was good at everything. Mm. It wasn't to be showy. In fact, and the second part of the sentence is, and you're a nice guy. Mm. So it wasn't something that I felt was a reason to show off. In fact, I just was good at everything I did, and including art. Like I won a competitive award to study at the Museum of Modern Art when I was in high school, etc. So I was good at these things. I was playing within the first few months of taking piano Rhapsody and Debussy and Bach. So I'm gifted. But I realized that I really can't do world-class work in those things. For starters, I don't have the hands of a great classical pianist. And I started too late. I started piano, I was much older. Most people start when they're 5 or 6 if they become concert artists, not everyone. But I realized what I can do is I have a very good mind for imagining other worlds. Mm. And that's what I did. I found a world that was so rich, I could imagine it for the rest of my life. And I was lucky that it happened when I was a freshman. I think I might have been my first term. A lot of people have existential struggles. My struggle wasn't what I wanted to do, which I was passionately committed to. Is how to survive it. It's just like if someone says, that's green, but I know it's red, I have a choice. Either I accept that it's red or I go crazy. I knew what I saw. I saw my discoveries before I had any equation for them. Mm. And I followed my heart and my imagination. I don't know. I'm not sure if this is very informative, but so I had some real high points and some real difficulties. I had people who wanted to throw me out of Rockefeller for nefarious reasons. They failed, mostly because they didn't understand what I was doing, and it made them feel, unqualified. But I got my PhD from Rockefeller, and then Mark Kotz and John Colorado, who were both professors there, wrote me glowing reviews. And I've always been lucky that way. Like when I got to Stanford, Richard Atkinson, who then went on to become president of the National Academy of Sciences, who was a professor of psychology, said, "Oh, you're the one Kemeny said is going to save mathematical psychology." Mm. So I always had someone who was, and Kotz wrote to MIT that I was the most creative person he'd ever met. Mm. So these people, came through when it really counted.